Here in the Northern Rockies, dark winter months are outlasted in basements, dens, and nooks, where kindred souls gather to share intel, swap fly patterns, and relive the memories from seasons past. This gathering spot, known locally as a February room, is the inspiration for this podcast. No matter the season, the door is always open to those with a fly fishing story to tell. Brought to you by CD Fishing USA, the North American distributor for Composite Development's fly rods and fishing accessories. Tech, precision, ingenuity, legacy. Go to cdfishing.us and follow us on Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook. Here's your host, Lauren Carnop, and this is the February Room.
Well, the boss is out and I am in. Justin here, and we all know a kindred soul that somehow we have never had an opportunity to really hang out with, even though we have many mutual friends and shared interests, and in this case, even from the same small town. And one of those guys for me is Bryan Huskey. Bryan, welcome to the February Room.
Oh, Justin, thank you so much for having me.
Man, it's good to hear your voice. What have you been up to, man? You're a photographer, a filmmaker, and you have your own podcast called Skylines, in which you share kind of your personal accounts and mishaps and misadventures in the woods. So I know you've got a good fishing story for us today.
Yeah, how much time do you have?
Well, we got about 45 minutes.
Yeah,
Fire away. We're on your time.
Yeah, I probably have a couple of stories, and it's fun to be here with you. It's fun to be talking with you. Thanks a lot for having me. And it is kind of crazy that we come from the same town and haven't had as much one-on-one encounter. So I'm glad that we get to connect like this. Is pretty cool. So
yeah, me too, man.
You asked me about some stories, and I kind of had to dig around for a while because I wanted to think of something original, something that that maybe I haven't written about or recorded on the Skylines podcast, because those are stories that are, I don't know that they're necessarily stories as much as they're, I don't know, they're almost poetic. I kind of write my storytelling based more on how I describe things than like, wow, that's a crazy story. Because it's kind of funny. I was just joking with my wife, like, I'm trying to think of some good stories. And it's like, I have all of these quote storytelling episodes, yet like it's very rare that I come home and there's been like this huge thing that happened where I'm like, oh my God, you're not going to believe what happened today. So I dug a little deeper and I actually opened up my photo albums to scroll through and go through the years to find something that like my pea brain just couldn't grasp on its own. And I saw some photos from September of 2014. I was in eastern Idaho, near the Montana border, hunting elk, actually, during the September archery season. And I had made my way up a 2-track road that was very rough. I mean, it was similar to the arroyos of Baja, or if anybody's been to Baja to see like the massive erosion that happens in those canyons, those desert landscapes where it's basically rocks and boulders and sand. And so this super, super bouldery canyon, driving up it in 4 low, getting up to where it broke over something of a horizon within the tight V. And lo and behold, there's a reservoir and a creek that, well, of course there was a creek, but there was a reservoir that like was big enough to think like, wow, it looks like it could hold fish. And so as luck would have it, I happen to have some fly rods and fishing junk in my truck. And so I just had to take advantage of the opportunity and like make some casts. And so I go out and I start fishing this little reservoir. And there's cutthroat in it, and I'm having a heck of a time fishing cutthroat. And after a little while, I'm looking up the creek, like I want to go up further up this creek. So I drive my truck up past the reservoir to a section of the road where it gets really nasty. And then I get to the point where I'm like, all right, this is just dumb to go any further. I'm going to be better off on foot. And so I park and I jump off. into the creek and fish my way up. And it's just one of those days that is beautiful. It was fun. I felt lucky. And frankly, like, how many times has a person found themselves out fishing on a day when A, they were hunting, and B, they did not expect to even be anywhere near water, much less water that had, beautiful cutthroat in it. They're small, but that's what small creeks usually have small fish. So, couple miles up, couple miles back down, and I'm almost back down to where the truck is at, and I see this just wild-eyed looking dude marching up the creek towards me with a rifle in his hand. And he does not see me, but I see him. I stop and I hold perfectly still, and he's panting, he's stumbling, and he looks a little messed up. Behind him, there's another fellow looking equally as wild and kind of sketchy. And the first guy yells back to the second guy, "Dude, I see it. He's right there. He's right there." And he's pointing and gesturing up into the canyon wall above me, not far above me. Again, they don't see me. And they're like raising their rifles and looking through scopes and yelling about, "There he is. Can you shoot him? Blah, blah, blah." And I'm just like, I'm kind of reluctant and weighing whether or not I should announce my presence and say, "Hi, hey guys, what's up?" Or whether I should just like try and duck and avoid. But I'm kind of pinned down with the way that they're headed, and so I kind of like splash along through the rocks and then pretend like I just looked up and saw them. And of course I'm in camo, yet I'm carrying a fly rod. And I'm like, "Hey, what's going on?" They're like, "Cougar! Did you see the cougar?" And I'm like, "Whoa, okay, all right." Now I'm kind of putting some pieces together. Like, okay, maybe this is making sense. They're like, "Cougar right there," and they're gesturing like it's like right behind me. And now they're like looking like right at me, and to some degree, waving their barrels kind of in my direction, referring to this cougar. But I'm like, okay, there certainly could be a cougar that's been very likely place and scenario that they could have seen a cougar run across the road as they described as they were driving up, and then they were taking off chasing it on foot. So I tactfully move my way away from the direction that they're assuming this cougar is at and get over to where I'm beside them, so that I am no longer in the direction that they're supposedly trying to shoot this cougar. And I get behind them, and then I pull out my camera, because I have my big backpack on with my camera on my hip belt, and I walk along behind them as they are, quote, stalking this supposed cougar. So I get behind them, and then I'm like, all right, cool. And I kind of let them advance, and I'm watching, assuming that they really had seen a cougar and that they really were actually seeing glimpses of it. And I'm like, this is kind of weird, because they're like, "There it is, right there." And they're like, "Oh, he's but it's like I'm putting the pieces together that like they're pointing at like 11 o'clock. "There he is, right there." And then like 5 seconds later, they're pointing at 3 o'clock. I got him, and I see him. And I'm like, in my head, I'm like, this is not making sense. These guys are fully tweaking, and they've got fingers on their triggers, and it's like, what's the movie where the peyote and the size of the chicken?
Young Guns.
There it is. Yeah. I felt like I was in Young Guns. And these guys are going to start opening fire in a culvert, that I'm in. And so I was able to like basically like back up and stop following them. And then just like I turned around and trotted as cougar-like as I could, meaning silently and quickly back to my truck. I get in my truck, I whip around, and then I go out. And then, of course, driving back out, well, I'm blocked in. because they stopped right in the middle of the road. So here's this just clapped out Jeep Cherokee that is just stopped in the middle of the road with the doors still open. By road, of course, I'm talking about what would be considered today, an ATV trail or whatever.
Jeep trail, yeah.
In one of these just tight, super steep, eastern Idaho arroyos. And I thought about like, what are my options here? Like, I really don't want to ride this out any further. And so my poor truck, I was like, all right, here we go. This is not a place that I would ever try and make a pass as if I was in a bike race or any kind of like driving or riding event. Like, this is not a place to like go off of the road and around another vehicle. But I was slightly approaching panic mode and just like, they're going to like think that I took their Cougar, or who knows how I'm going to quickly become the Cougar. I'm just getting out of here. And so I just had to drive around their truck that was blocking the road through boulders and rocks and the banging and the crashing and the clanking. And when you get in, anybody that's done much off-road driving, when you get into really, really gnarly situations, momentum is your friend. And the size of trash can boulders and brush and logs that I had, and not to mention the side hill, without actually sliding into their truck, I was like, I can't rock crawl through this. I've got to just send it. And I did. I just absolutely floored it to carry as much momentum as I could to crash over the boulders and logs and through the brush and get around to their truck, drop back down onto the road, and then exhale a huge sigh of relief, down out of that canyon, past that reservoir, and leaving nothing but a dust trail behind me, and maybe supposedly a set of cougar tracks. I don't know.
Oh, priceless, man. You never know who or what you're going to run into on the border of Wyoming and Idaho. Kind of along those lines, several years ago, some buddies and I were bow hunting elk, and we were up near the panhandle of Idaho. And my buddy had shot a really nice bull. I had killed a spike on the last day, and our other buddy was still out hunting. We'd been packing elk for 2 days, so we were just kind of done breaking down camp, and I decided to take the fly rod and go walk up this creek that was right by the camp. And kind of the same deal. It was loaded with cutthroat, and they were eating October caddis, and I was having a great time. And all of a sudden, all hell breaks loose, and just boom, 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 right next to me, this guy starts firing. And I'm like, what in the hell? And I'm kind of right by this little island, and I kind of duck behind the island, running for cover. And I look up on the island, and there's this big dead bull moose laying there. And here comes this guy on the ATV, and he yells at me. He's like, hey, can you come over here and grab my winch line and wrap it around that moose? Because I had waders on. And so I go over there, and I grab the winch line. Not only did this guy just about kill me, now I'm helping him out. But so I grab the winch line, and I go over and wrap it around the moose. And he had a tag, he had drawn the tag, and he was legit, as it turns out. And he'd been watching this moose. Like, he showed up late at night. A rig rolled in, and it happened to be him. So he showed up late at night and put the hammer down on this bull. He pretty much knew where he was going to be, I guess. And so I helped the guy, get the thing out back to his ATV, and he just winches it, loads it up, winches it back to his camp, and then he's got this elaborate system rigged up where he winches it up on this pole, and I'm kind of helping him butcher the moose for a while, because I'd never seen a dead moose before, which was pretty cool.
Right.
And so I ended up going back to camp, and he got the whole thing butchered, and in the morning he left me a couple of steaks and headed out of there. But
nice.
Yeah, it was awesome, but it was terrifying at the time. It was just like, he shot a .338 right next to me 5 times and just dinner plated this moose on this island that I was fishing. So,
wow.
Yeah, it was crazy. But, well, anyway, man, so as I referenced, you're a photographer, and you've made some really cool some really cool films too. The one that comes to mind for me is Dock of the Drakes, which was, a really neat human interest story. Can you tell me a little bit about that film and how that came to be?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I had started working doing content, media content, and social media management for an outfitter in Sun Valley, Idaho called Silver Creek Outfitters. And I had many dear friends that were guides that worked for Silver Creek. And one of those dear friends was Pete Wood. And it so happened that the brown drakes were just coming off on Silver Creek. And that's just a big deal with a whole bunch of hype and the visual eye candy of seeing just hundreds of thousands of great big mayflies coming up off of a spring creek at dusk in June in Idaho is just absolute gold mine for anybody with a camera and anybody that just likes to watch beautiful things. And so he described that he was going to have a client with him that had access to some of the water that is not open to the public. As we all know, as fishing guides, some people have access that is privileged. And he also described that his client was a very elderly gentleman with Parkinson's disease. And his name was Doc. Everybody referred to him as the Doc. And I said, yeah, I would love to go along, and picked up his invite to go fish with him and Doc. And so, beautiful things happened in front of the camera. That film, to this day, I think is very memorable, not because anything that I did with the camera, not because anything I did in editing. I think that story connected to people in such a way because it was a portrait of two people that frankly loved each other. Pete being one of the most loving, caring people you could ever imagine, and the Doc being a man who was so in need of help and not hardly any fishing ability of his own, yet after years and years as a very accomplished angler, worldwide angler and traveler, and world-renowned surgeon, Parkinson's had taken all of that away from him. And it was only because he had somebody like Pete, who was such as Doc described Pete, a natural born caregiver. And Pete would facilitate anything necessary for the Doc to be out on the water and fishing. As poorly as his fishing skills may have been, the two of those guys made magic together, and they had luck together on the water. Like Pete will tell you today that none of his clients that were the greatest rods in actual fly fishing ability could compare to the type of fish that Pete and Doc would land together, because Doc just had the magic. And anybody that's fished more than twice is gonna understand that a little bit of pixie dust, a little bit of magic can absolutely turn a day of fishing into a tremendous success or an abysmal failure. It doesn't matter how good you are if the mojo isn't right. And Doc just had the mojo. And so that story, I think, it captures a human element that I had nothing to do with, but the two of them just gushed with. The love between the two of them and the type of chemistry that they had with each other, but also with the fish, with the fish gods, with the river and the waters. And not many people realize that there is a sequel to Dock of the Drakes. And unfortunately, it just never got the wind under its wings, as everybody now realizes in social media. if you don't get the right connections to share something or promote something, it just doesn't get off the ground. And it breaks my heart that Hit 'Em Again doc, which is the sequel, it never got that wind under its wings, because it is a much more intimate look at the relationship between Pete and the Doc the year following Doc of the Drakes, after Doc had had brain surgery and an electrical implant placed in his brain to reduce the shaking that the Parkinson's caused. And that video, Hit 'Em Again doc, which is absolutely worth Googling. I'll send you the link when we're done. So if your
Yeah,
audience wants to see
please
it,
do, man. I have not seen it myself, so I'm guilty.
it is a story. I watched it this morning for the first time myself in a couple of years, because I just wanted to have it fresh in my mind, and it brings tears to my eyes every time I watch it. Anybody that has maybe seen Doc of the Drakes, they may have fought off tears, in that short film. When I watch Hit 'Em Again doc, I mean, it's like I really can't fight off the tears, because, and it's feel good tears. Um, so that's something that when it comes to filmmaking and storytelling, I think is an example of why characters count more than content, because my camera skills, my equipment level, my editing abilities, none of those things are any better than any person you'd pluck off the sidewalk. But when you happen to be fortunate enough to be around characters, that have this type of love between them, it's infectious and it drips success.
Yeah, no doubt, man. And I personally I prefer that kind of format, and that story that you captured. It was it was so well done, and I did fight back tears, and the ending's amazing. I'll go back and check out Hit 'Em Again, Doc, because I've not seen that. But as opposed to just the music video, drone shot, underwater. It's all the same stuff over and over again to me that I'm seeing now that a lot of folks put out there. Nothing against that, but personally, I am way more inclined to tune into to a human interest story such as that one you made. So nice job on that.
Oh, thank you so much. It definitely feels like, I hate to use the word accomplishment, because it's not really my accomplishment, but I guess I do have some level of credit for it, and to that, it makes me feel like it is an accomplishment of a lifetime, just in the sense that I heard from so many people over the years since then. I mean, that was back in like 2012 or something like that, 2011. I don't know. That was a long time ago.
Right.
But I just heard from so many people touching stories of how it connected them with maybe a person in their life, or maybe a time in their life. It touched people. And I think as a creator, whether you're a filmmaker, a photographer, a storyteller, an artist, a poet, whatever, touching people, connecting with people is the ultimate goal. And I feel like that was an effort that just achieved that so perfectly.
Yeah, and for me, I lost my father in March after he had a long battle with dementia.
Oh,
So
sorry.
yeah, thanks, man. So that storyline especially hit home for me. And when I went back and watched it here recently, um, yeah, it was tough to hold back the tears, as you mentioned, for sure.
Yeah.
Um, well, so another thing that you've done is you started the Keep 'Em Wet campaign years ago, and when this first came to my attention, I guess I didn't know that you were involved in it, and then I kind of found out later. I was like, oh, I'll be dang, Husky was part of that, or um, I believe you started it, right? Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. That's another thing that's kind of like wow. Sometimes sparkly little thing just falls out of the sky and lands in your lap, and, and you're like, it's like
I'm,
Doc
I'm
of the.
I'm still waiting for mine.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I hate to tell you this, Cardot, but you may have had it land in your lap and you didn't realize it. You just thought it was like a cigarette ash or something. You might have just flicked it off your lap and kept going.
Highly likely.
What's that cherry on my lap? Who knows? But yeah, that's another thing that was kind of like something happened to me. I really can't say that I ever in my wildest dreams had this aspiration where I'm like sitting there one day, disgruntled about what I'm seeing on social media. And I'm like, I'm going to come up with a hashtag and I'm going to turn it into this campaign about educating people about the science of catch and release. Like, no, no, that's not at all what happened. It was merely a matter of indeed a frustration that I was observing as Instagram was like really starting to just rocket. And it was a realization of like fly fishing and cold water trout, salmon, steelhead are such just rich, visually appealing eye candy to any audience. You can't. There's so much content of fishing that is so beautiful, of fish and rivers and beautiful places. And so many people that know nothing about angling are attracted and drawn into the sport, the affliction of fly fishing, because of what they see on social media. And they see images of what the average grip and grin looks like. And they think to themselves, this is how you do it.
Right.
And this is what it looks like. And it's the industry standard. This is what my feed is filled with. And so this is how I do it. And, frankly, I just thought to myself, like, man, there should be some explanation. There should be some context. If people would just keep fish wet, if they would just keep the fish in the water or hold them near the water. You see pictures of so many fish that were up on the dry leaves and bank, being bear hugged, hanging by their gills, whatever, blah, 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 blah. Hashtag catch and release.
Right.
So I'm putting myself in the shoes of somebody that's like, oh, yeah, I love catch and release. You catch the fish, you do whatever you want to it, and then you throw it back in the river, and it swims away happy, giving you a high five, and that's catch and release. Everybody wins. And it's like, how would somebody who doesn't know any better even question that isn't just exactly how it works? So I had this presentation that I had done for a local fly shop about trout photography and how I felt as a photographer. No, let me take that back. As an aspiring or accidental photographer, because I don't really claim that title with any deserving it at all. But at the time, people wanted to ask and hear about how I was, the things that I did for my photography of trout. And, a big thing was like, if you're going to catch a trout and you're going to release it and then you're going to take pictures of it too, then you are extending and prolonging, the time that you're handling that fish. And so I always felt like I better be really careful with the way that I handle fish, and I better set good examples. So that was part of my presentations. And one of the bullet points of that presentation was keep them wet. So a couple years later, Instagram's blowing up. Every single angler on the water now has a smartphone with a camera and is adhering to the protocol of like, oh, if you're fly fishing, you take a picture of every single thing you catch. And thus I thought to myself, I'm just going to like try and set a good example. The best thing I could boil it down to, if you're going to have catch and release practices, is like, well, if you just keep the fish wet the whole time, that would help a lot. And I just scrunched that together and used a hashtag that said keep them wet. And then, of course, after I did it, I searched it. And there were a handful of pretty hilarious posts that did have a keep them wet hashtag at that time, but nothing too crazy. The one I remember the most was actually a garage of like Lamborghinis and Ferraris that had flooded. And there was like $8 million worth of automobiles up to the windshield in water in a garage. But so that's kind of where it started, and from that point, momentum really built. The phrase, the unforgettability of the phrase, and for anybody that was aware of what catch and release meant, the connotation of like, okay, if you're going to catch and release fish, keeping them wet, and it evolved to where people recognized it, and I came to realize that this was turning into a movement that had potential to do real good. And so from that point, I knew that I needed to reach out to get the science behind it, that this wasn't just my personal axe to grind, that there's real science behind why fish handling matters. And, if you're opposed to dams, if you're opposed to netting, if you're opposed to all of any number of threats to fisheries anywhere you live on Earth, then you can imagine that, like, how many fish are being impacted by all of these different threats to fisheries. Is social media becoming one of those, and is the way that we catch and release fish becoming one of those threats also? And like, why not just learn a little bit and try and promote a little education on the subject? And so that's really how it got off the ground.
Right on. Yeah, Brian O'Keefe was on the podcast recently, and he spoke to, kind of the same thing as far as social media is concerned, and his opinion on it. And it's right in line with yours. And you certainly have raised awareness for a lot of people, myself included. I have definitely been guilty. Recently I read a book called Body of Water that was written by Chris Dombrowski, a guy here from Missoula. In that book, he described it's a book on the history of bone fishing and the first bonefish guide in the Bahamas. If you haven't read it, you should check it out. It's really well written.
Great.
Body of Water. And in the book, he discusses catch and release bone fishing. If you take a bonefish out of the water, that deteriorates this protective layer that they have on them that masks their scent from barracuda and sharks.
Right.
And I didn't know that. And there's science that behind it that says, a fair percentage of those bonefish become fodder for those predators right after, we release it and we're high-fiving our buddy. There's a cuda or a shark that can now smell that fish.
Yes.
So there you go. That got me thinking. I went back and looked at all my bonefish grip and grins, going, "Oh, nice job, jackwagon."
Yeah. We're all guilty of it. I mean, come on, we're all guilty of it. We can't look at ourselves through rose-colored glasses and be like, "Oh, I've never done that," because we all have. And so, I get that. I share that same sentiment with a lot of the ways. A lot of the pictures that I have myself, and this just kind of inspired an awareness to that. And if nothing else, maybe a few more people think about that too. And I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, for sure. And if you've been, say it's July or whatever, and the water temp's a little warmer and you've been fighting a particular fish for a while, maybe not take a picture of that one. The circumstances vary, but it's definitely an important thing to have in mind when you're handling fish and we're all out there catch and release fishing.
Yeah.
So it's one of the reasons why I prefer to fish for pike now. I don't have to worry about that. I bonk them, cut them up, and eat them. So
absolutely,
they're delicious.
Yeah.
Well, cool, man. Your podcast, Skylines. Tell me a little bit about that and how that began and where that stands now. You've put out quite a few episodes, I see.
Yeah. I really enjoy as I've told a lot of my friends and family, I really enjoy telling a recap of a trip, an adventure, whether it's hunting or fishing or mountain biking or whatever. I like telling stories once And then it's like, after you've told it once, you're kind of doing it a disservice if you tell it again and you don't have as much gusto and enthusiasm and detail the second, third, fourth, 100th time you've told a story. And so I became aware of the fact that, like, I actually don't really consider myself a storyteller, but I also don't consider myself an author. And so, because I'm, not trained or formally educated in either, but like, I have maybe a poetic mind. I have an appreciation for the type of writing and the type of, whether it's a book or whether it's spoken, a mix of storytelling and poetry. And every year after my various maybe hunting or fishing expeditions, every season I would send out these emails of what had happened and kind of a recap. And some of my emails started to get so long that I'm like scrolling through them. And one morning I'm trying to read this back to my wife as she's in the bathroom next door to my office room here. And I'm like reading this email, and it's like going so long that I'm like, who in their right mind is going to want to read an email this long? I had a list of, 50, 60 people that I would send these updates to.
I was on it.
And I'd get positive feedback about the content. And I thought, that's so much to try and read. Maybe I should just go ahead and record it. And then I can write even more. And then I can have fun with recording it and trying to, because I'm a horrible writer. The way that I write, like my run-on sentences are 3 pages long. And it's like, I feel like trying to, if somebody doesn't, everybody has their own cadence and their own delivery and the ways that they speak. And sometimes in print, it just doesn't translate. But I feel like in my head, that's the way it's rolling. It's kind of like, reading the lyrics to a song, and there are all kinds of songs out there that you could repeat in your own head, and it makes perfect sense. But if you saw it in writing for the first time, you'd be trying to read this and be like, what is this mess? So I started writing more, and then giving myself license to go down these different rabbit holes that my head would trip on when I would be describing something, whether it was like, oh yeah, I really remember as a little kid following deer tracks and looking close enough at the deer tracks that one time I found an arrowhead that was right next to a deer track that was barely sticking out of the ground. But I was looking so closely at this arrowhead or at this deer track that I found the arrowhead. Yeah, and analogies like that and different tangents were just fun and interesting for me to write about or describe. And so that's really what my podcast is. It's introspective in the sense of like, I think about what I'm doing when I'm hunting and fishing, and I ask questions that are sometimes hard to answer, and I explore those questions. And I try and describe the things that I have experienced in the field as if the listener was reading a book, and I want them to feel like they're looking over my shoulder.
Yeah, it has a real book on tape feel. I've only listened to a couple episodes, but I'm getting ready to head out to elk camp here in a couple weeks for a while, and I'm going to download a bunch of those. It's the perfect setting, when you're in the wall tent at night with the fire crackling, to put on a hunting story. And I really like your delivery on there. It really has a feel like a book on tape to me.
Oh, thank you so much. And that brings to mind, I will say one of my most cherished compliments came from a buddy who told me that listening to some of my podcast episodes is like listening to Metallica Black Album on the drive to go fishing.
There you go. That's a good compliment.
That's a compliment that I can connect with and think like, wow, that's really, really
that's strong.
An honor to hear somebody make that type of comparison.
Well, right on, Brian. Do you got one more fishing story for us before we check out here?
Oh yeah, sure. I'll tell you something that I learned this summer. In what's become a transition for myself as a typical trout and steelhead bum, fly fishing bum, I have really transitioned into becoming much more of a conventional tackle bass bubba.
Nice.
I am finding this journey fascinating and super, super fun to explore new waters, explore new species, exploring new tactics, and tackle. Like it is just like an absolute amusement park. And the opportunities around me to go fish for bass and maybe not see a single other person, as opposed to the opportunities to fish for trout or steelhead, where you're going to be like taking a number to get in line.
Right.
So a really funny thing that happened this last summer in my aspiration to be creative and to make the most of a small slot hall pass. I've got a couple hours before dark, and I've got maybe a couple hours of first light, and that's about the size of my window. So I'm like, why don't I just take my tiny little boat? And it is literally a tiny little Mirocraft, maybe 11 feet long, and a little 8-horse motor. And I thought to myself, I can put my cot in there, and I'll bring a sleeping bag, and I'm gonna buy pizza and a half rack of coldies, and I'm gonna run out to my favorite bass fishing pond. I'm gonna fish till dark, and then I'm gonna sleep on my boat, anchored up, and then I'm gonna probably, obviously fish at night as well. In Idaho, that's legal, and fish till I'm tired. Fish from my sleeping bag. What could be better? And then I'll wake up when, as soon as I wake up, and then I'm gonna fish again in the morning, and then motor on out of there. Well, come dusk, I'm familiar with being on in a slough, in a wetland, in bass environments at sunset, and the frogs are honking, the crickets are going, there's chucker up on the hill, there's dragonflies buzzing around. This happened to be in April or May, so there were turkeys gobbling and fluttering up to their roost. There were all kinds of sounds, and I'm like, wow, yeah, this is cool. And then it gets dark, and it's like fully dark, and I'm still fishing, and I'm listening to my popper chugging along. I'm excited for hearing that, unmistakable sound of a bass crushing a popper. And it gets louder and louder with all of these birds, all of these noises. And by midnight, I'm like ready to call it, and I'm reeled up and laying down in my sleeping bag on my cot in my boat, pretty still, anchored up against the tules, and the geese start honking. The ducks are quacking. There are beavers smashing the water like somebody took a cooler lid and, as hard as they could with both hands, smashed it like 5 feet away from where my pillow in my head is. I'm getting splashed by water because apparently where I had chosen to anchor my boat was right at an access point where beavers were coming in and out of the slough. I don't think I got a wink of sleep all night long, because it was like just when you feel like you're lulled to sleep by the sound of all of the other, the birds and the frogs and stuff that you can kind of tolerate, but then when somebody comes up and slaps the water as hard as they can right next to your head and you get splashed, I'm like, ugh! It was so surprising to me, and a realization that you cannot sleep in a wetland. At least I cannot. And it was, one of the worst nights of sleep that I've ever had, but also really funny to look back on, and amazing. Man, turkeys gobble all night long. And geese honk all night long and ducks quack all night long. And I even swear I heard like red-winged blackbirds doing their thing and like bullfrogs. Oh my God, the croaking. It was unbearable to try and sleep through. And I didn't have like the balls to just like put in earplugs and like just try and like close my eyes. I did have earplugs with me, but frankly, it was quite startling and scary that like I'm thinking like a beaver's gonna just like finally just jump up and crawl into my boat and, you know, bite me in the jugular.
It could happen. So you unknowingly camped at a beaver bottleneck.
It was precisely a beaver bottleneck, as it turns out.
That's awesome. Well, hey, man, thank you so much for joining us today. Check out Bryan's podcast, Skylines. You can follow him at Fishbite Media, right?
Yeah, Fishbite Media and Skylines Adventure. Those are the kind of the two handles.
Cool. And check out Dock of the Drakes and the sequel, Hit 'em Again, Doc. I'll be watching that here shortly, man. I'm looking forward to seeing that.
Go to thefebruaryroom.com where you can access a complete library of our podcast and read more about our guests, their fishing stories, and favorite fly patterns. We're always looking for exceptional fly fishing yarns, and if you have one to spin, shoot us an email at info@thefebruaryroom.com. The February Room is always free, but if you feel like throwing a nickel in the pond, we appreciate any additional listener support. For companies and individuals interested in sponsorship opportunities, please contact us for our media kit. Thanks for stopping by the February Room, and we'll see you down here next week.